To my perhaps limited knowledge, the history contained within this video to date has not been addressed by any government body that I am aware of. The date today is February 9th, 2024. The Tucker-Putin interview is the first official rebuttal received from Russia in rectification of Western culture. It's a foreign pulse to what has become Thunder Bay, but only in that our city's vast socialist and communist history has been buried after relentless campaigns of Crown-funded terror on our homes, our communities, and our ways of life within Northern Ontario. As you will soon hear, Thunder Bay had an integral role in the formation of the Soviet Union, and this fact has painted the city throughout the ages, and speaks to the contributions the city of Thunder Bay has made to existing socialism. It should be mentioned that this history speaks to the age-old European divide of the three bloodlines stemming from Europe: Roman, Gaelic, and Scandinavian. Though the socialist history has more Gaelic and Scandinavian roots than Roman, it should be mentioned Thunder Bay itself is by blood and by history a British culture existing within the Robinson Superior Treaty territory. The history mentioned implicates Russian and Finnish reality foremost, also indirectly having ties with the English, Scottish, Irish, and Welsh communities, as well as groups with deep ties to Thunder Bay, foremost the Anishinaabe of the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850, with the Ojibwe Indians of Lake Superior conveying certain lands to the Crown. The entirety of the socialist history took place within treaty territory. However, during the revolutionary period, when half the Finns fled to Russia to take part in Land's Great Experiment, there was no native impetus into communism shared with the Finnish, Roman, Irish, Welsh, or Gaelic socialists of the time. Lastly, not mentioned in this reading, is a history of unlawful behavior by what is now the Thunder Bay Police Department. At one time, in the soon-to-be-mentioned Communist Hall, the Port Arthur Crown Police Service destroyed the printing presses that were vital at the time for the flow of information across Port Arthur, Fort William, and abroad. This is, however, unmatched by the Thunder Bay Police current reign of terror, under the treaty-violating Indian Act, which Doug Ford could declare the notwithstanding clause as a premier of Ontario at any point. Every single premier in Ontario has this power, including Doug Ford, and he has used it before. Will he use it for the unlawful Indian Act? In Petrozavodsk, Russia, there stands a 30-foot statue of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin built by Canadians. Towering over the central square, with an eternal flame burning in remembrance of the victims of the Second World War, is a constant reminder to the people of this vibrant Russian city of their past. In the early 1930s, it stood as a tribute to the ideals and spirit of the October Revolution and the socialist utopia that the Finnish Canadians who built it had come to establish in what was then Soviet Karelia. Disillusioned by their lives in Canada and tired of endless persecution by Canadian authorities, thousands of Finnish Canadians left that country in the late 1920s and early 1930s to take part in Russia's Great Experiment. To them, as to many other socialists in Canada, it seemed that capitalism had finally gone bankrupt. As intriguing as the story of Karelia is, what follows is not an examination of the Stalinist purges of the 1930s and what other historians have described as a dark period in both Russian and Canadian socialist history. Instead, what will unfold in this volume is a story of those socialists who remained in Canada. Many who contributed to the construction of Lenin's statue were from Port Arthur and Fort William, Ontario, present-day city of Thunder Bay, collectively known as the Lakehead. The construction of the tribute to Lenin was possible because of the skills owned in the coal docks, railway yards, mines, and lumber camps of Northern Ontario. The same conviction and belief that went into the tribute to Lenin and the zealous attack on capitalism it represented have been used for over 30 years at the Lakehead to construct the many labor halls and temples that dot the two cities and to agitate for the recognition of workers and their voice within society. Although the statue of Lenin, built by Canadians, may surprise people today, in the 1920s and 1930s, its existence would have confirmed what local and national authorities believed about socialists at the Lakehead. As Port Arthur Member of Parliament F.H. Kiefer argued in 1919, certain areas of the country, such as the Lakehead, should be dealt with severely, as they were breeding places of revolution. The nature of the economic activity in the region, based on resource extraction, lent itself to widespread participation by the Lakehead laboring class in such movements as the Industrial Workers of the World, the One Big Union, and the Communist Party. In fact and legend, Lakehead workers were in the midst of a revolt from 1900 to 1935, one that has placed them at the very center of Canadian working class and left history. Located at the geographic center of Canada, bridging the eastern and western halves of the country, northwestern Ontario is a region that has no official political definition. Indeed, it is a region whose boundaries have been shifted constantly over time. Yet although there is no official definition, it is very much a distinct region in the minds of most people who live there. Often is a key part of the identity of its inhabitants. For much of its past, it has been composed of the three districts of Thunder Bay, Rainy River, and Kenora. As such, it is the largest region of Ontario, covering 526,000 square kilometers. Its western boundary is Manitoba, while its northern boundary is Ontario's Hudson's Bay coastline and the James Bay coastline north of the mouth of the Albany River. Its southern boundary is composed of the American border and the north shore of Lake Superior west of the Pukuksaw River. The eastern border runs just east of the communities of Matawaj and Karamat. In area, it is a region that is bigger than most countries in the world. One might ask, why the Lakehead? And why look to the Lakehead for a study of socialism in Canada? There is certainly no shortage of scholarship examining the history of the left in Canada. Few studies, however, have explored the relationship between ethnic groups, socialism, and the politics of labor in the early 20th century Canada. Fewer still have focused their attention on the provincial norths. This study reveals how the relationship between individuals and organizations in the region with their comrades and opponents elsewhere shaped the nature and characteristics of socialism both regionally and nationally. The 20th century Lakehead never lacked for a population of enthusiastic, energetic, and talented left-wingers, but throughout this period, the movement never truly solidified and took hold. Socialist organizations, organizers, and organs came and went, leaving behind an enduring legacy. Yet, paradoxically, the sum of their efforts came to lessen the immense sacrifices and energies they had poured into them. During the first 35 years of the 20th century, the region's working-class politics was shaped by the interaction of ideas drawn from the much larger North Atlantic socialist world with the particularities of Lakehead society and culture. International frameworks of analysis and activism were of necessity reshaped and revised in a local context in which ethnic divisions complicated and even undermined the class identities on which so many radical dreams and ambitions rested. The Lakehead's economic opportunities, both real and anticipated, drew workers to the region during the first decades of the 20th century. Located on the north shore of Lake Superior, it was believed by many to have the potential, like many regions of Canada at the turn of the 20th century, for unlimited economic success. As the Port Arthur Daily News suggested in 1906, the assets of Canada are stupendous. The country reeks with underdeveloped riches, agricultural soil, minerals, water power, navigable lakes and rivers, a healthy, invigorating climate. In fact, everything that makes a country great, waiting only for capital and energy of a man to develop it. From the heyday of Fort William as the inland headquarters of the Northwest Company to the brink of the Great Depression in 1929, the Lakehead was seen as a region of untapped and limitless resources, capable of fueling continuous progress and development. Jointly, the twin cities of Port Arthur and Fort William, both incorporated in 1907, acted as a metropoly for a resource-rich hinterland. The dockyards, lumber mills, and railway yards of the two cities were also viewed as the hub of the Canadian nation, having become the central railway and shipping point for the transshipment of the West's staple products in exchange for the manufacturing goods of the metropolitan centers in the East. Thanks to the railway and the mining boom, the Lakehead was a prime destination for capital investment and for immigrants. Both cities competed with each other for commerce and resources, and the working class conflict was centered in different locations. In Port Arthur, the area around the Canadian Northern Railway, CNR, coal docks and freight sheds, as well as the Finnish Quarter on Bay Street, were the focal points of socialist activities. In Fort William, the Canadian Pacific Railway, CPR, coal docks and freight sheds, and the area of surrounding May Street, Miles Street, and Simpson Street were where much of the unrest of the period was expressed. Much of the rivalry that has dominated the histories of the region was one produced, propagated, and used by the bourgeoisie of both cities, however. The two cities came to symbolize the freedom, adventure, mystery, and wealth of frontier America. The dime store novel Deadwood, Dodge, or Carson City of Canada. The village was described as the focal point of a mineral-rich region with unlimited potential. Even following the collapse of the market for silver in the 1880s, with the CPR as the only significant object of development in the region, potential still existed. Besides assisting immigrants to settle in the western part of Canada, the CPR also acted as a conduit for settlers to transport their goods back to the eastern markets. The most prominent of these goods were wheat before 1913 and lumber after 1920. The Lakehead, as a central terminus for Canada, benefited immensely from the accompanying national expansion. Its fortunes increased with every bushel or cord transshipped. The wheat that flowed through the Lakehead was integral to the prosperity of the Western world, the feeding of millions in Europe during the First World War, and the nourishment of the United Kingdom afterwards. Wood cut from the region helped to build the cities of central Canada during the industrial boom. The shipment of grain, wood, and other resources also led to the creation of a shipbuilding industry. Despite being over 1,000 kilometers from the ocean, the Western Dry Dock in Fort William became the largest of its kind in Canada. Its existence epitomized the railway industry's influence and the optimism that it generated in those living in the region. The emergence of the Lakehead as a major transshipment point in Canada and a demand for both skilled and unskilled labor in the region also led to its emergence as a destination for immigrant workers. As a central point in east-west communication, and combined with its ethnic diversity, the cities of Port Arthur and Fort William were storm centers in Canadian working-class history. In them, Eastern and Western socialists, trade unionists, and mainstream liberals fought and frequently influenced each other. The Lakehead thus interestingly complicates one of the major narratives of Canadian history, that of Western exceptionalism, by raising the example of a region that was simultaneously Western and Eastern. Similarly, the Lakehead's political, economic, and historic linkages to Minnesota and the Midwestern United States ensured that political and ideological fomentations to the south influenced many decisions to the north. In many respects, the Lakehead defies attempts to situate within the canonical series of events that has been used to describe the progression of Canada from colony to nation, or, more appropriately, what has recently been described as a process of liberal order. During the first 3 decades of the 20th century, between 32 and 35% of the population in Port Arthur and Fort William were non-English speaking immigrants. Although few Europeans had settled in the region by 1871, the construction of the CPR had spurred rapid growth by 1911. In 1900, the population of Port Arthur was 3,214, and that of Fort William was 3,997. By 1911, the combined population of both cities exceeded 27,000, and together they constituted Ontario's 5th largest city. The region accounted for barely 9% of Ontario's total population, however, and although the rest of Ontario was largely of British extraction by 1921, barely 50% of the population in Northern Ontario was. Even in 1921, after some immigrants had left the region, the British still made up only 62.2% of the region's population. The number of British residents in the region had declined to 54.8% by 1931, and this was reflected in the population of the Twin Cities, where close to 40% of the total population was of non-British origin by 1929. Although these populations were centered in neighborhoods that were often treated like ghettos in the south end of Port Arthur and the east end and westward areas of Fort William, their influence on society extended well beyond such neighborhoods. For example, the city and region were home to the second largest concentration of Finnish socialists outside of Finland, and they were not concentrated in just a few neighborhoods. Divisions and exclusion were an inherent part of this ethnic and political mix, but they were also a dynamic force in the evolution of the Twin Cities and its hinterland. Crusades to uphold Anglo-Saxon Protestant values and ideals led to a working class that was neither homogeneous or static mass, but rather represented a multiplicity of subgroupings, sometimes paralleling, sometimes overlapping one another. Ordinary people lived and breathed the political and ethnic tension of the period. Lakehead and Canadian leftists were hardly unique in their many ideological shifts. However, ideological transformation was a common occurrence among socialists throughout the world during the early 20th century. The work of Ian MacKay has recently demonstrated that three distinct fermentations driven by specific ideological underpinnings drove socialists between 1900 and 1939. As this reading demonstrates, however, although members of various ethnic communities at the Lakehead often joined forces and fought for common goals, ideological and ethnic differences, whether perceived, invented, or real, ensure that pan-national generalizations about socialists and their organizations are problematic. None did so in pure form, and each was significantly affected by the region's unique cultural and economic characteristics. The presence of so many Finnish, Ukrainian, and Italian workers add an ethnic dimension to the ever-changing nature and characteristic of socialism at the Lakehead. In many respects, beneath the class conflict of the early 20th century was a more pronounced interclass turmoil whose distinguishing feature was ethnic difference rather than material interests. With such a wide variety of peoples from different parts of the world, many of whom were from different regions of the same nation-states, the experiences of the different groups at the Lakehead produced, defined, and gave language to the nature of their relationship with one another. In the Twin Cities, ethnicity was often tied to language usage, phenotypical appearance, and length of time in the country. The non-English-speaking, darker-looking, and more recently arrived Finns were considered to be radically different from, and in many ways inferior to, the English-speaking, fair, and more settled Anglo-Saxons. Ethnicity arose from an interplay of such differences, arbitrary though they often were, and once a particular category was solidified, the Finns, the Galatians, the Indians, it was not easily questioned or replaced, even in the face of evidence that all such designated groups were internally differentiated, complexly demarcated, and fluid over time. Ethnicity both strengthened and weakened the left. It strengthened it by creating the cultural conditions under which left-winged ideas could be brought to groups culturally marginalized within the hegemonic cultural order, with such ideas serving as ways to understand and reshape the oppressive conditions of everyday life. It enabled radical ideas to go beyond their working-class bases into different socioeconomic strata. Yet it also weakened the left because each ethnic group, in the relative privacy of its language, was likely to develop its own distinctive vocabulary of socialism. Moreover, those with superior positions in the game of ethnicity were almost inevitably found to defend their relative privileges against those who were marked out as inferior at the cost of a more fully fledged solidarity. The Lakehead legacy was one in which socialist solidarity was always both intensified and qualified by ethnicity. A sense of ethnic identification and protest against ethnic discrimination fueled many Lakehead leftists, particularly the region's many Finns and Ukrainians. Yet, ethnic feelings also permeated the ranks of the Anglo-Saxon labor aristocracy, from which the Finns were largely excluded, intensified its drive to circumvent radicalism with forms of conventional trade unionism or political centrism. As will become apparent, ethnicity both strengthened and weakened socialist organizations at the Lakehead. If working-class radicalism grew to almost unprecedented levels in the region, which became the epicenter of the Communist Party of Canada, CPC, it also caused unrivaled levels of frustration. In this sense, the statue of Lenin in Petrozavodsk, marginal to this story in one sense, stands as one of its central symbols in another. Many of the Finns who built the statue did so out of their heightened sense of revolutionary activism. Yet they built it thousands of miles away from Canada because they had come to believe that left politics in Canada itself was a hopeless endeavor. Stymied by factional infighting, labor aristocratic oppression, and police repression, among other things, such activists as Atte Pitkänen, a well-known member of the Port Arthur District Young Communist League, would see in Soviet Karelia their only chance to play an active role in a socialist society. Socialist movements necessarily combine social, cultural, and political work. Intrinsically committed to the fundamental restructuring of society, they recognize both the identities of individuals and the groups to which they belong. In a culturally heterogeneous terrain, a successful socialist movement will recognize the depth and tenacity of various forms of identity. It will struggle to articulate them to an overarching project, one that challenges the hierarchies and inequalities inherent in the capitalist system. In the early 20th century period covered in this book, the ideology of multiculturalism was unavailable as a way of thinking through such problems. In essence, the largely Anglo-Saxon-dominated labor movement, and even, paradoxically, a socialist movement made up disproportionately of recent immigrants, lacked the conceptual and political tools to address, let alone resolve, the problems raised by ethnic diversity and hierarchy. If, at times, this incapacity took the form of ethnic prejudice and exclusivism, at many others it simply assumed the unconscious, day-to-day repetition of the common sense of the surrounding Canadian liberal order. If any rigorous notion of multiculturalism requires, explicitly or implicitly, a politics of recognition, one that philosopher Charles Taylor argues must recognize the equal value of different cultures and not only allow them to survive, but acknowledge their worth. The historian of Lakehead leftism often confronts the systemic misrecognition of the other in the region. During the first 3 decades of the 20th century, socialist organizations in fact depended on the support of those ethnic groups that under the liberal order had been unable to achieve recognition. The primary focus of this reading is on institutions, especially parties and unions, with close attention to the ideas and principles championed by these organizations, and the ways in which they challenged or confirmed underlying social and cultural patterns. Many fascinating cultural topics and personal biographies lie outside its scope. This somewhat traditional focus can be justified with particular force in the case of the Lakehead, because no other study has sought to bring this international history together, and also because only on the basis of such a solid framework can more wide-ranging theoretical and ideological analysis be successfully undertaken. Much more work still needs to be done in the years to come, but just as the work of Ian MacKay and Suzanne Morton on the labor revolt in the Maritimes between 1919 and 1920 attempts to bring it back into the collective memory of that region, so this study of socialist organizations at the Lakehead between 1900 and 1935 aims to remember its contested and complicated legacy for the benefit of a new generation of activists and scholars.